FlightBridgeED Podcast Series. Hey everybody, Eric back with you with FlightBridgeED. Today we're going to start off where we left off. We had just completed a podcast on manipulating gas laws and utilizing gas laws to our advantage in our clinical practice as it relates to the HEMS industry. Today we're going to jump into oxygenation versus ventilation. And I know in previous podcasts, one of the first podcasts we published was on cellular respiration, and I dove really deep into cellular function, aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, and things like that. Today we're going to talk about how to affect change with oxygenation and ventilation on our tough patients as it relates to ventilator management. I think as I've taught around the country in different levels and capacities, I see that is a big area that we can improve on. And I think it's just, it can be confusing manipulating the ventilator in different ways to affect change in those areas. And I think it's real easy to mix things up. So we're going to talk about oxygenation. We'll kind of re-hit Henry's Law and Graham's Law as it relates to our clinical practice as flight medics and flight nurses. And then we're going to talk about the ventilation aspect, and we'll hit CO2 diffusion and everything that encompasses that with a ventilator. So starting off, let's kind of recap oxygenation, how we bring O2 into our body. So it starts out at 21% oxygen. Remember, that's atmospheric air. Regardless of the altitude that you're at, you're still at 21%, but Dalton's law affects the partial pressure. So as we increase in altitude, those oxygen molecules become farther and farther apart because the pressure, barometric pressure, as we increase actually decreases, so the pressure against those oxygen molecules decrease. So as we increase in altitude, the available oxygen becomes less and less. So let's talk about just if we're at sea level. At sea level, our pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. At that point, at 21% oxygen, that gives us a partial pressure of oxygen starting out at about 159 millimeters of mercury. As that O2 molecule comes into our mouth and we start inhaling that, it becomes humidified. As it becomes humidified, it dilutes out. And as it travels down our bronchioles and it reaches our alveoli, we're at a PaO2 of about 104. Remember, as the deoxygenated blood that's returning from our heart, it's trying to pass by our lungs to pick up oxygen. That oxygen concentration, or our partial pressure of oxygen as it's returning from our heart, is about 40 millimeters of mercury. So we are going from a higher concentration at 104 to a lower concentration of 40, and that is going to equalize. And so our hemoglobin is picking up oxygen, and our oxygen molecules are dissolved in plasma. As those hemoglobin are passing by deoxygenated, you have hydrogen that's attached to it, you have CO2 attached to the hemoglobin. Those things jump off, O2 jumps on, and that is propelled through our body, and our tissues and our cells pick those up as fuel to promote aerobic metabolism. If we talk about how to affect change, remember the easiest way to affect change with regards to oxygenation is by utilizing Henry's Law. And we said Henry's Law can be applied in three different ways. And the first way is we want to increase the concentration. So remember the analogy, if you had a cup of blood, that cup of blood would represent maybe blood in the capillaries, and at 21% you have all these oxygen molecules floating around. Well, what do we do with RSI? We increase the concentration, we increase the FiO2 by optimizing oxygenation in that way. That increases the oxygenation, so we've now added a whole bunch of O2 molecules on top of the 21%, so our concentration of O2 in the blood has now increased. And then the second thing we do is we apply pressure. So we can do that in multiple ways, whether it's positive pressure ventilation, if it's volume targeted ventilation on a ventilator, or it's pressure initiated volume targeted ventilation. But we're applying pressure to promote those O2 molecules to diffuse through that solution, the solution being blood. The third thing we do is we apply PEEP. And so we apply PEEP, and that causes an increased surface area. So remember, I used the analogy in the past podcast where I said if we had a cup of blood that was 4 inches as far as the depth goes, and we put that same amount of blood in a pan, a large pan or a boiling pot, that amount of blood would maybe only come up to a ½ inch. So we've increased the surface area. There's more area for O2 molecules to diffuse through. And so that's what we do when we think about ventilator strategies. We're trying to optimize the surface area. We're trying to improve functional residual capacity. So we're inflating the lungs to a safe point. Remember, we don't want to overinflate. And then we're maintaining that surface area with good PEEP maneuvers. All right, so how does that apply to our ventilator competencies or our ventilator strategies? Well, when we have a patient that's hypoxic, and we're trying to improve oxygenation, there's two main ways that we can improve that. And the first easiest way is to improve the concentration, and we just learned that in Henry's Law. The first thing we do is improve the concentration. So if you're at an FiO2 of 40%, you're going to increase that up to 100%. That's going to be the quickest way to improve oxygenation status on a patient. Regardless if they're in an acute phase or they're in a chronic phase. If you have a hypoxic patient, we need to try to improve that oxygenation as quickly as we can, because we know that oxygenation equals cellular function, aerobic metabolism, and we need that for cellular activity. The second thing we're going to do in these patients is we're going to make sure that we have good inspiratory maneuvers. And what I mean by that is, are we providing a tidal volume that's adequate for this patient? Remember, we don't want excessive tidal volumes. We want good, adequate tidal volumes that are going to give proper inflation of the lung that's not going to cause too much pressure, reflective of a plateau pressure that's greater than 30. So we want to minimize that. But we want to have good maneuvers based on ideal body weight that's going to inflate the lung to a point where you're recruiting as many alveoli as possible. So if we confirm that we're doing that, the third thing we're going to do is we're going to add PEEP. And PEEP on a severely hypoxic patient is really important. Obviously, we have to watch out for problems as it relates to hemodynamic instability, increased interthoracic pressure, and things like that. I'm not going to dive into that in this podcast, but just for purpose of oxygenation, the first thing we do is we increase FiO2. The second thing we do is increase PEEP, all right? And we want to make sure our inspiratory maneuvers, so our alveolar recruitment is optimized based on good strategy. If you've noticed, I didn't say anything about increasing the rate or affecting change with the ID ratio or anything like that. And I think that's the big confusion, is people think, well, if I have somebody that's hypoxic, I'm just going to increase respiratory rate. Because if I give them more breaths, it's going to improve the oxygenation. And that is absolutely not what we want to be doing. That effectively changes ventilation status. That changes our CO2, either retention or blowing that off, and we're going to get into that in a second. So remember, to improve oxygenation in our patients, we need to make sure we increase concentration. We're going to make sure we have good inspiratory maneuvers, and we're going to improve or increase our PEEP. Those are going to be the biggest things. And by doing that, you're essentially affecting Henry's Law. And we can apply Henry's Law in our clinical practice in every patient if you think of it in those 3 steps. All right, so now let's dive into the ventilation side of it. The ventilation side of it, remember, is the regulation of CO2 in our body. And if you remember from my ventilator management podcast, and if you haven't listened to those, there's three parts to the podcast series. And I encourage you to maybe listen to those first before listening to this, because it'll make a little bit more sense. But remember that your CO2 regulation is a more complex process, and it's something that as our patients become sick, their lung compliance starts to decrease, they become fatigued, the CO2 regulation aspect is the harder part to manage. So let's kind of look at how CO2 plays a role and how we can affect change. All right, so let's discuss CO2 production. And before I jump into CO2 production as it relates to this lecture, I wanted to explain how aerobic metabolism produces the proper amounts of CO2 for CO2 regulation and how essential that process is. Before I dive into that, though, I have to say that in an anaerobic state, so in an oxygen deficient state, we produce actually more CO2. So you're producing CO2 from both an aerobic state and an anaerobic state. But in an anaerobic state, because of the whole
process that happens so fast. Remember, we have a splitting of the sugar into pyruvate. We have an oxygen deficient state. So at that point, we have what's called fermentation. And the fermentation process, that pyruvate turns into ethanol and CO2. So we have a constant revolving door. We're producing a lot of CO2 in that manner because of how quick that process happens. If you were to compare those two processes, aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism, and you compare the amount of CO2 produced per fermentation versus aerobic energy, you would actually produce more CO2 per chemical reaction in an aerobic state, so in an oxygen-rich state, than you would in an anaerobic state, in an oxygen-deficient state. But because of the anaerobic state taking so much longer, having 3 steps, having the glycolysis phase, having the Krebs cycle phase, having the electron transport phase, that takes much longer, so the amount of CO2 over the whole process is actually less than in an anaerobic state where you have just the glycolysis and the fermentation. That produces an abundance of CO2, and that's why we see in an anaerobic state, we see increased acid, we see an abundance of CO2 that drives our pH down, and it drives our lactic acid up, and we see these metabolic acidosis. For purposes of this lecture, though, what I'm trying to illustrate proper CO2 regulation and how we're supposed to do that. So anytime that we can make our patient be in an oxygen-rich state, in an aerobic state, we're going to have better CO2 production and regulation. So how does that work? Well, remember from our earlier podcast on cellular respiration, we have a splitting of our glucose molecule. That glucose molecule starts out as a 6-carbon chain molecule. It splits into 2 pyruvate molecules. Each pyruvate molecule has 3 carbons attached to it. From that point, we have a chemical reaction. That chemical reaction, those pyruvate molecules turn into acetyl-CoA and CO2. From that point, that produces what's called FADHs and NADHs. And those are the prime ingredient for ATP production when we get into the electron transport chain. And I'm not going to get into that whole process. But the CO2 production happens in the Krebs cycle, happens in that splitting of the pyruvate molecule in an aerobic state. And that produces the proper amounts of CO2. So that's the first step of producing CO2 in the proper amounts for CO2 regulation, is to have an oxygen-rich state, to have aerobic metabolism. So to recap, that's the first step in regulation of CO2, is an aerobic state, an aerobic respiration state. Now let's talk about how CO2 is regulated as far as our buffering system, how it's carried by the blood.
All right, so let's look at CO2 a little bit closer. CO2 is constantly shifted out of the cells based on what's called an intracellular shift or intracellular gradient, and it's shifted out of the cell into the blood. All right, so at this point, about 93% of the CO2 that's in the blood is carried on hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is floating along, and it's floating along in the blood. Well, what makes up blood? Plasma makes up the majority of blood. The biggest makeup of plasma is water, right? 75% of plasma is actually water. So that CO2 is on the hemoglobin. It's floating around in the plasma. The plasma is made up of water. Well, what happens is that CO2 binds with the water, and it forms what's called carbonic anhydrase. At this point, it turns into carbonic acid. You have a splitting of the hydrogen and the bicarb. The bicarb is then expelled out. You have free bicarb that's floating around in the blood. Then the hydrogen jumps onto the hemoglobin molecule. And so now we have a hemoglobin molecule that has a hydrogen on it, and you have a CO2 molecule on it, and there's not a lot of room for O2. And if you remember from earlier podcasts when we talked about oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, and specifically looking at a right curve, the big aspect of a right curve is we have what's called Bohr effect. And Bohr effect states in an increased acidotic state, so increased CO2, increased hydrogen, right? Hydrogen equals acid, and a lower pH, right? So an acidotic pH, your hemoglobin is going to have a less of an affinity for O2, and it's not going to allow O2 to attach. It's going to keep dumping it off to the tissues. Well, here's the reason why. Because if we're constantly producing too much CO2, that CO2 in this whole process I just explained gets turned into hydrogen. That hydrogen occupies a seat on that hemoglobin molecule, a seat that could be occupied normally by an O2 molecule. All right, so we have one of the aspects there. And if you remember, a right shift on the hemoglobin curve, although it's not normal, it's all right for the patient, because what you have is you have a lower O2 stat, because remember, hemoglobin concentration of oxygen is represented by a SpO2, and so you may have a lower O2 stat, but you're going to have excellent tissue oxygenation, so your PaO2 is going to be excellent. All right, that's how CO2 is processed out of the cells, jumps onto hemoglobin, which is eventually expelled out of the body. But remember, we have to have that cardiac output to allow that blood that's carrying the hemoglobin to pass by the lungs, so that's blown off. The third thing we have to have good CO2 diffusion is we have to have no shunt or no ventilation mismatch of any kind. And so a shunt that would really affect CO2 diffusion would be something like a pulmonary emboli. And here's why. Remember, CO2 is about 20 to 40 times more soluble than O2. So it diffuses through a liquid very easily. So it has to take a massive shunt, ARDS, something that's completely blocking that alveolar capillary membrane, to cause a diffusion problem that's slowing CO2 being blown off. And then the next thing is we have to have an adequate minute ventilation. If you heard the podcast, remember, minute ventilation is everything on a ventilator. We have to have a good minute ventilation to overcome dead space. And so we have to have a minute ventilation that's going to allow for CO2 regulation. And so that is something that we utilize the calculation of 120 cc's a kilogram a minute. This will give you a good minute ventilation. It allows you to overcome dead space, and you shouldn't have problems. So how does this relate to us with a ventilator? Well, remember, minute ventilation is going to be something that can directly affect CO2 regulation. So we've got to have a good minute ventilation. And, you know, do we increase the tidal volume or do we increase the rate? I was always taught always fluctuate the rate first, because you should only have to increase or decrease your rate by a couple points. With a new lung strategy where we're using lower tidal volumes, we don't want huge fluctuations with our tidal volumes. So it's a little bit easier to increase or decrease the rate to affect minute ventilation as it relates to bringing our end tidal CO2 up or down. The easiest thing, though, and it's something we all forget, is we have a function on our ventilator called an ID ratio. And remember, your ID ratio is going to be your inspiratory time versus your expiratory time. So if you have somebody that's retaining CO2, you would want to lengthen that ID ratio out from a 1 to 2 to maybe a 1 to 4. If you have somebody blowing off too much CO2 and you had an ID ratio that was a little bit lengthened, like a 1 to 4, you would want to bring that back down to a 1 to 2. It's that simple. So the way I handle my patients on a ventilator is I affect change via ventilation, so CO2, by affecting my ID ratio first. I try not to mess with my minute ventilation. I calculate my desired minute ventilation based on the calculation that I just gave, the 120 cc's a kilogram a minute. I understand that is going to allow me to overcome dead space. And I know that's adequate. I know I've got a good respiratory rate based on that. I've got a good, safe tidal volume. And I've got a good minute ventilation. So why do I want to mess with that? So the next thing I can do is I can affect my ventilation status via my ID ratio. And that's what I do. All right. So how do we fix these problems as it relates to CO2? Well, the big thing, aerobic metabolism, we have to optimize that via good oxygenation. And if we have already increased our concentration of oxygen, trying to fix our oxygenation status, like we just talked about manipulating Henry's law, that should start bringing our cellular function from an anaerobic state to an aerobic state. So that's one way. The cardiac output aspect, well, that's a huge, huge thing. And so remember that we have to optimize cardiac output. And a lot of times cardiac output is going to be optimized. It's going to be improved by good oxygenation. So we have to do that. We have to fill the tank. We may have to give pressors. We may have to give an inotropic medication once we get that blood pressure up to a safe point. But that's important to optimize cardiac output. The diffusion aspect. Well, how do we improve shunt? If you have somebody that has a pulmonary edema, they may need thrombolytics. But a lot of the other shunts that we talk about, whether it's attention pneumothorax, ARDS, pulmonary edema, anything like that, we improve shunt by good inspiratory maneuvers and by PEEP. So you should see a common denominator here. By affecting oxygenation, by affecting Henry's law, by improving the concentration, by adding pressure, and by improving the surface area by adding PEEP. And if you do that, you should affect your ventilation status as well. They kind of go hand in hand. Because if you improve the oxygenation, you should improve cardiac output. If you improve the surface area, you should improve shunt. And so you're kind of fixing both things. So remember, to improve oxygenation, we're going to increase concentration via FiO2. We're going to improve our surface area with PEEP. And we're going to confirm we have got good inspiratory maneuvers. On the ventilation side, we're going to make sure we have a good minute ventilation. We're going to make sure we have good cellular function by making sure we've got good oxygenation. That's going to drive aerobic metabolism. We're going to make sure that we've got good cardiac output to help regulate that CO2 to propel that out so we can blow that off through the lungs. And we're going to make sure we fix the shunt. So everything really comes back to Henry's law. Henry's law is everything when it comes to oxygenation and ventilation. And then remember, your last gas law that we talked about in our last podcast is Graham's law. And Graham's law is the simple aspect of diffusion from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Remember, oxygen is the big aspect there. CO2 diffuses very, very effectively. And so if we fix the other aspects, the cellular function producing CO2, we fix the cardiac output, we make sure we've fixed the shunt, and we've got good minute ventilation, the CO2 should fall right in line. All right, we're going to stop there. I think that we've covered oxygenation versus ventilation pretty thoroughly. I think this builds on the other podcasts. If you have any questions on this, please email me at eric@flightbridgeed.com. I think if you utilize these strategies, if you remember Henry's law and how we can manipulate gas laws, I think that that's a great way to fix both of these, and you should be successful. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks so much for following FlightBridgeED and making us successful. We're nothing without you. This has been one of the best things I've ever done as far as education goes, and I really appreciate all the following and the listeners. So we'll talk to you soon, and have a great day. We want to thank you for following FlightBridgeED.